Hi, I'm Jeff Kegris. How do you feel about unfair labor practices? Would a company with poor labor practice affect your purchase of their products? Do you have many clothes and shoes of the same brand? What are some of the most recognizable brands in the world? I bet you would include Nike among these brands. Would you be surprised to learn that Nike has a history of major labor practice issues, including forced labor, unsafe work practices, underage labor, and below subsistence level pay rates? Nike's foray into questionable labor practices started in Korea and Taiwan as they expanded globally. Organized labor movements in these countries prompted moves to other locations. Moves to Indonesia, China, and Vietnam were pushed by Nike onto their contractors in order to lower labor costs. A slight timeline of Nike's labor issues began in 1991 when a man by the name of Jeff Ballinger issued a report. This report documented low wages and deplorable working conditions of employees in a Nike facility in Indonesia. In 1992, Harper Magazine followed up this report by Ballinger with an expose. This expose cited numerous labor violations. It featured a worker from this Indonesian facility that made 14 cents per hour, which was lower than the country's minimum wage. It also included details on unsafe working conditions, underage employees, and inhumane treatment of the employees of the facility. Nike's issues continued into 1992 with Olympic protests in the Barcelona Olympics. This gave a worldwide spotlight to working condition issues of employees in developing nations, especially those tied with Nike. This continued in 1993 as CBS began to interview workers from these facilities and showed the exploitation of workers in Indonesia by Nike. In 1993, Jeff Ballinger created the organization Press for Change. This organization was set up in order to provide consumer information and monitoring of labor rights issues in the developing world. Nike's issues continued throughout the 90s and were highlighted in 1997 by major protests at promotional events. The opening of Nike Town stores throughout the country were publicly protested, and it was at this time that the sports media also began to challenge Nike spokespeople like Michael Jordan and Tiger Woods. In 1997, there was also many college students that began to organize protests at their university. They wanted to voice their disapproval of the university relationships with Nike and their connection to unfair labor practices. Many major universities were involved, including the University of Illinois, Penn State, North Carolina, Colorado, Florida State, Michigan, and others. In 1998, demand for Nike products began to drop and layoffs began. This weakening demand for products that caused layoffs forced Nike into a position where they realized that change was needed. In 1998, Nike CEO Phil Knight finally accepted responsibility. He made a public statement that said, quote, "The Nike product has become synonymous with slave wages, forced overtime, and arbitrary abuse. I truly believe the American consumer does not want to buy products made under abusive conditions." In 1998, Nike also began to address these problems. Phil Knight vowed to raise the minimum age for workers and to apply U.S. OSHA standards in its overseas factories. In 1999, Nike created the Fair Labor Association. This was a nonprofit group that combined companies, human rights, and labor reps to independently monitor these facilities. In 2002, there was major strides made when factory audits began. In a 2-year period, over 600 factories were audited. Repeat visits to these factories helped to ensure that problems were either being corrected or that where they continued, that they were identified so they could be resolved. After these factory audits in 2005, Nike began to make real strides in changing the standards and working conditions in these factories that were contracted to make Nike products. Nike had a code of conduct, but a robust code of conduct was also created at this time. It stated that employment must be voluntary. It could not be forced labor, prison labor, or any form of indentured servitude. A minimum working age was established that had to be 16 or past the legal age of required schooling, whichever was older for that country. It also guaranteed a freedom to bargain or associate, even in countries without these protections. For countries that did not have these protections, a parallel means for employees to organize themselves for collective bargaining or association had to be provided. A standard work week was also set up that consisted of no more than 48 hours. Once past those 48 hours, overtime had to be paid and consensual. Any hours past that max must be strictly voluntary and had to be paid at a premium rate in excess of the normal wages. Employees also were afforded a minimum of 24 consecutive hours off every week. The pay for the employees must be a fair wage that was at least as high as the country's minimum wage and provided for discretionary income above living expenses. Facilities were also required to provide legally mandated benefits like holidays, paid leave, and statutory severance if employment were to end. The Code of Conduct also stated that harassment and abuse would not be tolerated. Employees were to be treated with respect and dignity and would not be subjected to physical, sexual, psychological, or verbal abuse of any kind. In 2005, Nike also began to become very transparent and publicly disclose their information. It was at this time that they issued a 108-page report that detailed the issues that were found in the audits of their facilities. This acknowledged and identified the issues of working conditions and pay and allowed the company to set up plans to attack these issues and develop real solutions. It was at this time that Nike also published a listing of all the factories on its website. They were the first company to do this. You can still pull the information up on the web at Nike.com. You can pull up factory information for any location that will show the product and employee demographics for that location. Nike at this time also committed to using third-party audit organizations. This provided for unbiased assessment of these facilities and was a change to previous practices where companies would use their own teams to go in and audit. When nonconformances by these third parties to Nike's Code of Conduct were found, the company required several things. First was an immediate investigation. Following that investigation, they needed to have a collaborative corrective action between the factory leadership and Nike representatives. This corrective action had to address the root cause. Root cause had to be identified to ensure that not only the individual violation was addressed, but that similar issues could not be repeated. Follow-up reviews are then done, and if repeat violations are found, the facility is subject to sanctions by Nike, including an up to termination of their contract. So Nike has it set up for responsible divestment. If a factory contract is to be terminated, a glide path for reduction in orders is prepared. This helps ensure the impact of the employees in the community is not sudden and drastic. If there are issues with underage employees found in any Nike facilities, the contracts require that the factory provides a means for the employee to complete the required levels of schooling or vocational training to the minimum age. Following the completion of schooling, the facility is then required to rehire the employee if the employee desires employment. Nike also created a sustainable manufacturing and sourcing index to help manage their facilities. This index is built on a score that consists of metrics that are tied to lean manufacturing at the facility, human resource management scoring that's tied to compensation, training, and employee support, and is also tied to health, safety, and environmental regulation scoring that meets or exceeds those set up in the Nike Code. Facilities are rated as bronze, silver, or gold and are routinely reviewed to verify scores and adherence. Bronze is the minimal standard for a Nike contract facility. Those that attain gold status are considered the benchmark, and best practices from these facilities are utilized to push up the scores at bronze and silver facilities. Any factory below bronze is categorized as either red or yellow. A yellow facility must have specific remediation plans in place to improve their scores to either gain a contract or remain contracted. They are reassessed to ensure that they meet these standards. If they do not, or if they are found to be in red status, these facilities are set for contract termination. In conclusion, Nike created many of the labor issues that were reported in the 90s as they rapidly globalized and sought cheap labor in developing nations. They initially denied that they had any issues in labor practices and later blamed the contract manufacturers for not providing safe and humane working conditions for their employees. Eventually, Nike came to accept responsibility for these issues that were reported in the media and came to understand that creating better supply chains that protected workers led to better products, higher quality products, and improved company results. Once they accepted that change was needed, they were able to develop a comprehensive and robust code of conduct and leadership standards that drove follow-up and direct actions that improved their facilities. As a result of all of these changes and Nike's transparency, They have become an industry leader in supporting responsible overseas manufacturing. They've even started collaborating with competitors, which they believe is required to affect real worldwide change in manufacturing conditions and the support of fair labor practices in the developing world. Thank you.